Okay, thank you all very, very much. I'm incredibly excited about the second panel. This is about using AI for good. And I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Sally Kornbluth, who is the 18th president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She received a bachelor's degree in genetics from Cambridge University, and then a PhD in molecular oncology from Rockefeller University. She had a distinguished research career at Duke University and then became a brilliant provost and administrator of that university, and we are very fortunate to have her here. What you didn't know, however, is she also has a bachelor's in political science from Williams College. And this makes her especially ideal for this setting at the interface of technology and politics and economics and the set of issues we're grappling with today, which is how we meld technology with our moral objectives to produce an environment, a society in which we all want to live. So I'm going to turn it over to President Kornbluth, who will introduce the other panelists. Thank you so much.
That sounds great. Thank you. So thank you, David, and good afternoon to everyone, and thank you all for being here. In a moment, I'll introduce you to this all-star lineup, but first I want to just say a few words about the topic of our discussion, shaping technology for social good. So last year in my inaugural address, which seems, I can't believe it was only a year ago, I touched upon MIT's responsibility to help humanity come to grips with the tectonic forces of artificial intelligence. I use the word tectonic to try to convey the enormous scope of AI's impact and how fundamentally new technologies may shift the way we live, work, and understand ourselves as humans. But even knowing what's at stake, we're not always sure how we should proceed. AI has evolved so rapidly that many of us, including some of us at MIT, feel like we missed a lecture or two and we need to catch up. AI is causing us to rethink how we teach, how we learn, how we communicate, how we care for our health and the health of the planet. And it's even making us rethink how we think. AI applications have so many potential benefits that it can be incredibly tempting to forge ahead before taking into account the potential risks. There seem to be countless factors to consider as we focus on how to develop policy to get us on the right track and keep us there. And it's not only the technology part that's immensely complex. Defining what constitutes social good is no easy task. Fortunately, we have an incredibly insightful and accomplished group of panelists today to help us think about these kinds of questions, and I'm delighted to introduce them to you. So Brian Deese at the end is the director of the White House National Economic Council and an MIT Innovation Fellow. He's focused on developing strategies to address climate change and promote sustainable economic growth. As an advisor to 2 US presidents, Brian was instrumental in rescuing the US auto industry and negotiating the Paris Climate Agreement. He also served as the global head of sustainable investing at BlackRock, where he helped drive greater focus on climate and sustainability risk. Dan Huttenlocher, who's known to many of you, is dean of MIT's Schwarzman College of Computing. His background is a wonderful mix of the academic and the industrial. He helped found Cornell Tech, a digital technology-oriented graduate school. He's been a researcher at the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, and he served as CTO of a fintech startup. Dan is an internationally recognized researcher in computer vision and the analysis of social media, and saving the best for last, he holds a doctorate from MIT. We have here Frank McCourt. He's the founder and executive chairman of McCourt Global, a family firm working across industries from real estate, media, and sports to technology and capital investment. And Frank also founded Project Liberty to help build a better internet, one where users have control over their data, a voice in how platforms operate, and greater access to the economic benefits of innovation. In 2021, Project Liberty released the Decentralized Social Networking Protocol, or DSNP, designed to help social networks create social networks that foster more meaningful, constructive dialogues. And then we have in between, I went out of order, but Ziad Obermeyer, trained as an emergency physician, who now spends most of his time on research and teaching at UC Berkeley. He builds machine learning algorithms that help doctors make better decisions. And his work on algorithmic racial bias has influenced how organizations build and use algorithms and how lawmakers and regulators hold AI accountable. Ziad is a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and co-founder of Nightingale Open Science, a platform that makes massive medical imaging datasets accessible for nonprofit research. All of our speakers have fascinating insights to share, so let's get started. So why don't we begin with Brian? We've asked the speakers to speak for 5 minutes, so let's see how we do.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for convening and really for training a focus on this core question of how we actually more effectively harness technology for the social good. Hugely important in lots of ways. I know we're going to spend a lot of our time on this panel talking about AI. I want to start sort of one step back at core technology. My reason for that is because I think that there's actually broader lessons we need to learn here, but my underlying reason for that is I know less about artificial intelligence than any of the other people on the panel, so it's better for me to go first and establish that before they all do. So I just want to talk a little bit about the right way to think about the government role in this core question about training technology for social good, and start by, I think, making a distinction we often miss between two important governmental functions. We have the governmental function to foster innovation, and then the government function to regulate innovation. And I think we often, and I will put this on policymakers, I think often make the mistake of thinking about the principal goal of the former being to try to promote good, and the principal goal of the latter to try to be to discourage bad. And what I think that has done is, in both cases, it's brought a policy-making approach to technology and innovation that largely brings these questions of the social good in ex post. After we have either tried to foster good or tried to mitigate bad, we start to think about these questions on the back end of the development of innovation. And when you get to that point, it's extraordinarily difficult for policymakers to play an effective and additive role. So if I could offer sort of one very simple takeaway, that if we are going to actually make progress on harnessing technology for social good, we have to figure out more ways to pull forward these questions earlier on in the governmental process, both as a fosterer of innovation and as a regulator of technologies, to bring that more earlier on. So I want to offer just one example that's not AI related in that context about what's happening in real time with government policy today. So most of the government efforts historically to foster innovation, including through funding basic curiosity-driven research and others, have actually been agnostic to this question of the ultimate social outcomes, and have said we want to create innovation, and then ultimately we want to see where that innovation goes. We have recently started to run a set of experiments to try to do it a bit differently, and to try to say, on the front end of investments in innovation and investments in research and development and deployment, how do we actually pull forward this focus on labor, on community, on society? And we're doing that principally in the area of the government's efforts to try to foster clean energy innovation. And so if you look over the last couple of years in the government policy around clean energy innovation, there's an explicit effort, one, to embed labor and to give labor leverage in the context of government-funded research that's trying to foster clean energy innovation. Two, there's an explicit effort to try to prioritize place and community-based outcomes in the government's efforts to try to spur innovation. And three, there's an effort to try to tie governmental efforts to foster innovation to positive public outcomes. Some quite controversial to academic research communities around limitations to the deployment of innovations funded with public dollars. But I raise all of these because there's a lot of this is actually a place where there's a lot of novel policy being undertaken that was designed to try to pull that forward earlier in the process, to say if we provide communities, workers, and the public interest earlier on, can we actually produce better outcomes, better social outcomes? Early evidence is very promising in this respect. both in terms of the direction of investment, where it is flowing, in terms of the benefit flowing to workers. And so I think that there is a lot to learn on that front. The other admonition I would say as we move and shift this into thinking about AI, every element of what I just said has been intensely controversial. And if you look in, my background is economics and economic policy, if you use a static economic model, in almost all cases, the things that I describe are viewed as constraints to optimized growth or optimized efficiency. And so I think we also need to, broaden our lens when it comes to policy of thinking about what is a constraint versus what is an opportunity. And I think that those lessons we should think about transposing onto this question of how the government operates as an effective fosterer of innovation with respect to AI, but more importantly and more timely in terms of regulating as well. So with that, and your effective timekeeper on the front end, I'll pause it there and turn it back over to you, Sally.
Great, thank you, Brian. Dan.
Super. So I also want to set some context, but maybe a different kind of context, one related to AI. So when we think about AI and shaping the future of work, or frankly, more generally, AI and shaping our future, period, in almost all human endeavor, it's really important for us to begin to understand how AI differs from pretty much any previous technology. And this difference is not necessarily the difference that you see in the everyday dialogue. This difference is not about AI taking over the world, about AI subjugating humans, despite the science fiction and a lot of the public dialogue. Rather, it's about how AI fundamentally changes the nature of what it means to be human. So AI does not fit our centuries-long view of reality. Since the Enlightenment, people's understanding of the world has been defined by two things: human reason and human faith in the divine. AI now brings to bear a new non-human form of intelligence as a third means of understanding the world, which is neither human reason nor faith. As AI outstrips human reason, it certainly seems quite plausible that this is going to be a big challenge to our view of ourselves and our role in the world. But at the same time, AI can stand to really elevate human reason in the understanding of the world as we bring AI and humans together and develop really new pinnacles of understanding. Okay, that's pretty lofty. What's some more practical implications? Well, there are, I think, three that I think are important in this context. So the first is, it's going to be even harder to predict the effects of the AI revolution than of any previous technology revolution. And we all know how the internet revolution went, and in fact, Frank's been somebody really, I think, speaking about how to fix that. But this one's going to be even harder. Second, there are literally no norms for human interaction with AI. But if you think about trying to shape or to govern or to regulate something for which there are no norms, it's almost impossible to think about how you do that effectively without norms. So that's the second thing. And maybe there's an example to make that concrete, which comes out of some pieces that we've been writing lately in some policy briefs. Like, everyone knows what it means to shove a fork in a toaster, right? So we've been referring to this as the fork in a toaster problem. Across cultures, across communities, you get it. You did it, it's your fault. That wasn't always true, actually. Early toasters had exposed electric elements, and it was easy to electrocute yourself. And so what happened over time is societal norms developed and the technology changed to make it difficult to not follow those norms of understanding. So we're nowhere on AI in terms of both the technological evolution and the set of norms that need to evolve with it to define things like legal liability and effective regulation and other things. So that's the second one. The third is that this fundamental nature of the changes wrought by AI actually pretty explicitly calls for a particular approach based on collaboration between humans and AI. And this is not a new idea about bringing together human reason and this new form of intelligence rather than relying on either one alone. In fact, our own J.C.R. Licklider here at MIT in 1960 wrote a paper about this. But with all of the recent advances in generative AI and machine learning generally lately, it's now imperative that we understand how to actually take this kind of an approach, integrating humans and machines in doing this kind of technology and not just depending on either one alone. So now let me try to bring this back to the questions here around AI and the future of work and shaping the future of work. So let's just think about the hiring process for a minute. The use of AI screening tools constitutes the use of AI by itself in hiring, right? You run it first, and then whatever the AI says, now you pick up after the AI left off. This is standalone AI, exactly the thing that Licklider, and I think it's important that we reject. So the natural reaction there has been to say, oh, well, we should ban the use of AI in hiring, or we should audit all of these things in advance and delay the use of them in hiring until we're very sure that they work well. And how we're sure they work well and we don't have good norms is another problem, but leave that aside. But if instead you think about approaches to using AI, where AI is a collaborator with humans in the hiring process, and in fact, if you think about any human hiring process, it's people working together in some way. It's not one person making a decision alone. If you bring AI into that hiring process, that combination can actually yield better results than people alone or AI alone. So there's an approach there that can work and can actually help us do a better job of developing norms and understanding AI. So with that, I'm also at time. Thank you for your effective timekeeping.
Yeah.
So I think at least when I think about aligning AI with social good, my mind leaps to the politics and the regulation and the deployment challenges. But I want to go back one step and refocus on, I think, a very important technical part of AI that has huge implications for how it's regulated, how it's deployed, and that is the data from which the AI learns. And I think that it's very hard to think of, there's like an optical illusion element to AI because like when we're interacting with ChatGPT, it really feels like you're interacting with something and it doesn't really feel like this is just a next word predictor. But understanding that it is in fact just a next word predictor can be really helpful in trying to understand how we use it effectively and how we avoid some of the dangers. So I have a parallel story I want to tell you from medicine, which is where I work, that I think illustrates those points. And I think in medicine we see the same thing because we often hear and even are guilty of saying things like, oh, the AI is reading the X-ray. So here's an example. AI is trained to look for signs of arthritis in the knee, large cause of pain globally. And we say that the AI reads the X-ray for signs of arthritis, but how does the AI learn to read? Well, if you look at all of the literature, the AIs have one thing in common, is that they learn to read an X-ray by learning from doctors. And so AI has shown a bunch of X-rays. That X-ray is paired with a number, usually the Kellgren-Lawrence grade. So this is an objective scoring system. Radiologists look at the knee, they grade it from 0 to 4, and the AI learns to predict that number from 0 to 4 based on the image of that the X-ray that it's seeing. So that all sounds very reasonable. Here are two major problems with that. Number one, if all an AI is learning to do is to replicate a human's judgment, what is that AI going to be used for? It doesn't take a lot of imagination to see that that's going to substitute for human labor out of the box rather than complementing what humans are trying to do. Now, I know radiologists are expensive. I know we spend a lot on healthcare. So maybe that's OK in this particular context. But here's the second problem, which I think is a bigger problem. When an AI learns from humans, it also learns to replicate all of our errors and biases and prejudices and problems. And so you might ask, OK, well, what is this Kellgren-Lawrence grade? Well, it turns out that there are two doctors, Kellgren and Lawrence, and they were working on studies of coal miners in England in the 1950s. And if you look at the table 1 of their study, there's no mention of like the demographics because they were all the same. And so one problem with that score, which is still in wide use today, is that it misses a lot of causes of knee pain on X-rays that weren't present in that original population that Kellgren-Lawrence algorithm was trained on. How do we know that it misses those causes of pain? Well, because we trained a different kind of AI to read those X-rays. We trained that AI not by learning from the doctor, but by having the AI listen to the patient. another important human whose opinion you might want to consult when you're dealing with an X-ray of someone's knee. And so that AI learned to correlate features of the pixels from that image with patients' report of pain, which I'll add is actually what doctors Kellgren and Lawrence were trying to do in those initial studies, initially in the 1950s, but without the benefit of thousands and thousands of X-rays from a very diverse set of people like we have today. And so that AI has huge practical implications, because if doctors are missing causes of pain in the knee, that could account for the fact that even though Black patients have many times the incidence of knee pain, they have about half the likelihood of getting knee replacement surgeries and other remedies for that knee pain. Because if the doctor doesn't see a problem, the patient is sent home with like, call me in the morning, take some Tylenol, and does not get referred to that orthopedic surgeon. So I think that doing that project really made me optimistic about the role that AI can play in rebuilding the science of medicine, rebuilding a lot of other things that we do, and doing it in an equitable way. But I think it's hard to, when you look around at how AI is built today, it's hard to be that optimistic, because almost all the AI we see, from ChatGPT to hiring to predictive policing, are fundamentally built on this edifice of human judgment, not on more enlightened and sophisticated measures of the ground truth. And I think once you see that problem, you can't unsee it. Our predictive policing algorithms are trained on arrests or convictions. Our hiring algorithms, as Dan mentioned, are trained on what an interviewer thinks, which is why an early Amazon effort ended up with a pool that was 90% white and male. Everyone got mad at the AI, but that's just what the data looked like. And so I think as we think about aligning AI, paying attention to that data and making sure that we're using data that speaks to the truth rather than to human judgment, I think is a really important part of aligning AI with social values.
Thank you. Frank.
Sally, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be back in Boston. As a native Bostonian, I'm happy to be here. I'd like to elevate the conversation for a moment to set some context, at least from my perspective, in terms of what we're up against here. I just finished writing a book, and I wanted to think of a metaphor or a framing device for where we're at right now. And I chose the American Project as that framing device. And the reason I did was that I felt it was a moment, and by the way, inspired by Thomas Paine's Common Sense, a relatively straightforward document, a pamphlet that really spoke in accessible language about what was at stake. And what was at stake at that time were, he made the argument that the colonists had a choice, right? These early settlers had a choice. They could remain subjects of a monarchy, or they could choose citizenship and a set of human and property rights that up until that time they didn't possess. And it was really just framed in, as people's choice, and one could choose to remain a subject or move off in a different direction. And by framing it in such a simple way and empowering individuals to actually make that choice, it set in motion a set of outcomes. And here we are, nearly 250 years later, having built something really remarkable in the time frame when you think of what was created in this country in just over a couple hundred years. And the reverse is now happening in a way. So as rapidly as the technology has advanced, we are regressing socially and becoming, returning to subjecthood. The way the technology is designed, and I'll get to that in a moment, we have been stripped of a fundamental set of rights that were the core premise of everything else that was built, right? So we had simple protocols, thin layer protocols, a Declaration of Independence, a US Constitution, and a Bill of Rights that established the set of rights and the ideals, values, principles, call them what you will, that we built this great country on. Lots of things were built on it, you know, that were not all predicted at the time, but enabled by, again, these core simple protocols. And what they were based on was this ability of individual agency, ownership, control, consent, permission, and in other words, individuals locked into their society, their governance, their economy, their country. And so let's slide over now to different type of protocols, you know, TCP/IP, for instance, which connected all these computing devices and created the internet. And then HTTP, which connected the data regardless of what device it was on, enabling this fantastic technology, both of which were intended to decentralize and democratize. And then the so-called web age was, its promise was, I think, short-lived, because we entered the app age. And in the app age, everything was centralized. And then suddenly, our data became very, very valuable to a few platforms that aggregated and applied. By the way, algorithms are, you know, another word for AI, right? Machine learning, call it what you will. This is, and the point is, we've unwittingly, perhaps, delegated this power to a few platforms, the only platforms with both the massive data sets, you know, the huge amount of data, and the compute power to actually benefit from this next era of AI. So my final point is, I think we need to reflect on where we are, return to the basics, fix the internet, which is the source of the data, so that individuals once again have agency, ownership, consent, control, and feel like we're part of the future as opposed to being dragged into a future that is we have zero input into or ability to influence its outcome.
All right, well, thank you all. That was a great setup to some of the things we want to talk about. And actually, your comments, Frank, lead right into sort of my first question, which, you know, if we think of social media in particular as a test case for a new technology that had great promise and also a lot of risk, the results now seem to indicate a lot more risk than we had originally anticipated. And, you know, what do you think that, not we, but society or the inventors of social media, what did they get wrong? What can we learn from this?
Well, what we've gotten wrong is, again, we've delegated this, you know, the power to a few platforms, and we need to shift that power dynamic back to individuals. First of all, if we're going to be governable and be a society that can actually, whether it's a policy initiative or any other social good objective, we need to be able to understand, you know, what are the set of facts we're dealing with here, and what are we trying to optimize for? When you contaminate the information ecosystem so that there is no ability to discern, there's no ability to kind of navigate forward. We're all in this kind of Library of Babylon, right? We're just in this space where as I say, the information ecosystem is so contaminated, it's hard to know which way to go, and everybody can make up their own kind of set of alternative facts. And by the way, when we talk about social, we should think about the social media platforms are like poster child for what's gone wrong, but it's actually our social graphs that DSNP is focused on. It's not just social media applications. It's anything that actually scrapes our social graphs and aggregates that data and then applies some indice or algorithm to it to optimize for some purpose, right? And in these social media platforms, when they optimized for time online, you know, stickiness and selling ads and kind of a surveillance type of technology and a surveillance type of capitalism, we have this situation now where we're broken. We're kind of broken as a society. And I would just conclude by saying, because AI is actually a more powerful version of the same tech architecture we have now. The architecture hasn't changed. The compute power has. And so why in the world would we just, knowing that we're broken and we can't function and we're not governable, why would we allow a more powerful version of the same broken design to be enabled and unleashed into the world? Let's fix the design and then do massively positive things with AI and the technology, because the technology is awesome. How it's being used is very, very destructive right now.
Right. And, you know, as Ziad expressed, you know, there's a huge human element into how it's deployed. So your example of how, you know, scraping data, someone is deciding what data needs to be scraped and then how that's incorporated into the next iteration.
You know what I'd like everybody to do? Every time we use data, just think personhood.
Yeah.
Think it's your, in the digital world, it's you. It's not your data. Data is unemotional. It's just an abstract term. It's our personhood that's been scraped. It's our personhood that's been stolen. And that's why we're not, democracy has no chance with autocratic technology. Autocracies will do awesomely well.
That's right. That's right. And we've seen some of that. So, you know, thinking about, you know, this panel shaping the technology for social good, part of it is, you know, what is social good? Who gets to make the decisions? And this comes again to, you know, who decides how an algorithm's going to be built, who decides what data sets are used, et cetera. And how do we come to a consensus? So just all of you, maybe we'll start with Brian. Based on your own thinking about social good, what do you think the most important things, what are the things AI should accomplish?
Well, I want to start by answering that very profound question with just a reflection back on Frank's points, because it goes to sort of who is right to answer that question. Right? One of the things that I was consistently surprised by in the context of being a policymaker, looking at a number of questions around autonomy and security when it comes to people's data, is when people are asked the question and then asked a set of sort of revealed preference behavioral questions, both in terms of their response to inquiry and then their behavior on the back end of that, they are consistently willing to trade off security for convenience again and again and again in ways that Frank's admonition, I think, is the right one, and the one that I wish for society that there was more of, that when people recognize how personal their data is from an autonomy perspective, they would be more protective of that. Mm-hmm. But I think we also have to acknowledge that the desire for convenience and simplicity is powerful, and so that question is one that we have to take great care in terms of who answers that question, because the risk, of course, is that we answer it in a way that actually constrains some potential from outgrowth from this technology that we would constrain on the front end of that. But I think that, look, I think the core answer to that, you know, that question is that it should, you know, help to enable and amplify more human flourishing. And I think that in order for that to happen, and I think you see this across a number of the examples that people have put forward, we need to find ways of pulling people, and the right people, the people whose data it is that is empowering the technological outcomes, the people for whom their perspective actually shapes the outcome as opposed to they're on the other side of using this. We have to create structures where those people are at the center of the project and earlier on. And the one thing that I would say on that, which I think connects something that both Ziad and Frank said, is given how far we are on in the process, doing so will feel quite disruptive. I think the only way that we can do that, given where we are today, is to take a set of steps that will feel quite disruptive as well. I was thinking, as Frank, you were speaking, that when we talk about the issue of AI and regulation, we go immediately to too narrow a universe. When to talk about the issue without talking about antitrust in the United States misses a big core of why, a lot of the reason why we ended up with the risk, that I would say asymmetric risk with respect to social media platforms, is we operated in an environment where the network benefits of scale were so great and the antitrust paradigms were so ill-enforced that we ended up with a situation where we didn't have the kind of competition that would have reflected the views of users and consumers and patients, in lots of different examples. And so on the back end, we've thought a lot in the FTC context about what you do about algorithms in the social media context. But doing it on the back end means you've got to do some pretty disruptive things if you want to get pushed back up and get workers or patients or the end owners of the data to actually be meaningful participants in the project.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the companies captured the right to decide what social good is or to ignore social good if they wanted to. One thing.
Or we created a legal and social contract to enable them to.
That's right.
That was a policy choice associated with a set of laws and regulations.
Yes. One thing while we're talking about all this, it may be a bit of a tortured analogy, but maybe Ziad will appreciate this. As a cancer researcher, it makes me think about how patient advocacy groups for particular diseases have been very strong in trying to determine, how clinical trials are run, how technology is developed for diseases, et cetera. And the question has always been, how much do you have to know about the process to be able to have input into it that's valuable? And, I think a lot of the sort of black box nature of AI and people not really understanding it makes some people feel like maybe they can't have valid input. And I'm just wondering, Ziad, as you think about, you mentioned, AI making humans more effective and powerful rather than, replacing humans. How do we think about that? What kind of policies are needed, particularly in the medical realm, where I think there are very strong emotions, as I said, patient advocacy groups, et cetera, people who want to understand what AI is going to do to their healthcare, but may not have the knowledge to do that, understand the capabilities, understand the trade-offs, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's very related to this last part of the conversation around defining and who gets to define social good. I mean, we can all agree that we want social good. We can all agree that liberty and freedom and the pursuit of happiness are good. I think the problem with AI is that AI doesn't operate on that level. AI operates on the level of, here is a data set, here is a variable. What is the objective function? What am I minimizing in this data set? And a lot of those concepts that we can all agree on at a high level turn out to be very slippery when you get down to the data set level. So like health, there is no variable called health or sickness in our cancer data sets or any other data sets. And so I think that, for me, given that as both a researcher and, I think just as a person who engages with the healthcare system, there are many different measures that you might want to use. And I think right now those measures are buried. And they're buried online too. Facebook doesn't tell us, we are deploying a lot of things to keep you on this platform as long as possible and to maximize the number of clicks. But it actually would be very useful if we had that level of transparency about what the algorithms are doing. So it's true that AI is a black box and that there's a big complicated function in there that's doing stuff with a lot of variables. But usually it's predicting one thing. what's that thing? Let's talk about that thing. It's not so dissimilar, to make another life sciences analogy, to the process that leads to the definition of a primary outcome in a randomized trial. So the pharmaceutical companies would love to define their primary outcomes as something super easy to measure in like 30 seconds that they can do for everyone so they can get there. And the FDA says, no, that's actually not adequate. We need you to do it. So I think there's a very careful and context-specific negotiation process that has to happen that's very domain-specific. But I think that transparency about exactly what the AI is doing is very important. And you don't need to have a PhD in computer science to know, oh yeah, predicting that variable doesn't seem like a very good idea.
Yeah, I mean, that's a segue. And Dan, maybe, I know you've thought about this too. The question then, even at the governmental level, how do you legislate, regulate, make laws for technology that you don't understand and that you might not even understand the notion of, the sort of single outcome?
Yeah, I think a lot gets made in discussions about how can we regulate it if we can't understand it, and sort of pushing for explainable AI. But I think that there are practical things that we can do in terms of looking at outcomes. In fact, if you think about much of regulation pre-AI, we regulate outcomes. If humans do some bad thing, then then there's some determined punishment for them. Once in a while, we try to get inside their head and figure out what their intent was, like premeditated murder versus manslaughter, but you still killed somebody, right? So both the times there was an outcome that was not permissible under the legislation, and we don't get in our heads. So I think there's too much focus in the AI of trying to understand it rather than trying to understand the outcomes, which I think is aligned with what Ziad was saying. And I think there are practical ways to move forward with that. And in fact, in some of the policy briefs that we've been working on for Congress with David Goldston in the DC office, and also was Huttenlocher, who's sitting right over there, is that because so much existing regulation and legislation is about outcomes of what humans do and don't do. What constitutes discrimination in a hiring process? We have to at least hold algorithms and AI to those same standards that we hold humans to. And we're not actually doing that in many cases today. So I think there really are practical things we can do. They probably won't be enough in and of themselves. But it also stops us from getting, I think when there's a new technology that we don't understand, we also get sort of very caught up in, we need a whole new approach to thinking about it. I don't think we do, actually. I think we can do very sensible things. And so if you look at the EU AI Act draft, I mean, they've gotten themselves completely tied in knots in trying to define what are high-risk uses of AI. Well, let's forget about that. We already regulate most high-risk things that humans do.
Right.
So that's a pretty good roadmap for where we want to pay attention to what AI is doing. So, it's sort of outcome-based, and it's the things that we already view as being risky for society, risky for our norms and our values as a society.
The point, Dan, that you're making, just when you talk about Europe's policy objectives, I think it's a good proxy for the following. Europe is fairly clear on their policy objectives, and this is even prior to AI, GDPR, DMA, DSA, and so forth, all precursors, by the way, because again, it's the same technology, just a more powerful version, but they don't have influence over the actual tech architecture, right? That's let's face it, the choices today are primarily Chinese technology or American technology. And so they're focused on American technology. That's what is, the citizens of the EU are using. Because there's a disconnect between the policy objective and the actual tech and how it's engineered, there's no ability to really to affect those policy objectives. What I'm arguing is that we have an engineering problem, is what we have first and foremost. And we fix that, return some ownership and control of the data to individuals, get them connected to what's going on. Fix that piece first before we really turbocharge all this. And the second point is that let's not think of just social media platforms as the one optimizing in unhealthy ways for society. Social media platforms aggregate our social graphs and apply a social index. Search platforms aggregate our data and apply a search index. Shopping apps do the same, aggregate our data and apply a shopping index. It's all the same thing. It's data being aggregated and using AI, algorithms, whatever, optimizing for something. Until we regain control of that and reset and build, I think we're going to be just chasing our tail. And I don't think any policy objective or regulation will ever keep up. We need to innovate our way out of this.
So why don't we, all really interesting points. I think we have 10 minutes left. Why don't we open it to the audience, see if anyone, yeah, back there.
Just a comment and a little bit of a question that kind of connects all these things. Licklider's 1960 paper is phenomenal, but there's also an amazing paper he wrote about policy in 1979, because in addition to being a great innovator, he was also one of the great practitioners of industrial policy in American history. And that's called Computers in Government, strongly recommended to everyone. It really connects all the things that you're talking about. And in particular, it highlights the way in which the US was at that very moment turning away from supporting the fundamental protocols that Frank was talking about and towards AI and cryptography and things like this. And I kind of wonder what you all think about the way that public policy can support these directions that can lift up those fundamental protocols and thereby build the basis of this human-machine cooperation that he was so focused on.
Anyone want to comment?
Well, I'll use that occasion to make a quick point, which I wanted to follow up on Dan's point, which is, I think one important element is to not allow the reality of complexity to become a shield against practical policy steps being taken.
Totally agree.
I cannot remember a policy meeting that I sat in Washington on the topic of AI that didn't start with an admonition that this is all really complicated and most people in Washington don't understand it. And that is true, in one sense, but it is much more often used as complexity is much more often used as an opportunity for those who have the most to gain economically from avoiding regulation, to try to create this veneer that only a few people can actually engage on the topic. So I think that one big piece of what needs to be done here is to start with basics and to actually build capability up from that. I mean, a very simple point. We don't in the United States have even basic protections around the privacy of children's data. The reason for that is not because it's a complex issue. The reason for that is not because the American public is split on it. This is not, unlike some of the other convenience versus privacy issues, this is an issue that is a 90-10 issue in the public. The reason for that is because there are a small set of companies that have disproportionate market power and political influence, and so we can't get things done that are basic and simple. So that's, I think, one of the answers in the political economy vein is we need to not allow complexity to be a shield, and we need to start somewhere with some basic steps. And that is true. That's possible with respect to data. You don't have to go all the way to Frank's vision, which I like. You don't have to go all the way on day one to recapturing all of our control. There are things that we can do that actually we could prove out, and if they, if they're positive in direction, they create more actual more space to do more going forward.
A good example, I think, of how policy and innovation interact is, I'm thinking about in 1993, we started a telecom company called RCN. We built it in the major cities in America, including here in Boston. The internet as we know it today was nascent. Yeah, but we saw the power of connecting your phone, your television, and your high-speed internet access. We were the first ever to bundle. And it was interesting. People came to sign up, and many, it said, come back to me later when I can have my phone number. In other words, the fact that they couldn't own their number, they would sign the contract and say, here's my phone number, and we had to say, sorry, we can't give it to you, because the oligarchs of the time, the 7 baby bells, say they own your phone number. And you know, but in 1996, there was a Telecom Act passed, phone numbers became portable, carriers became interoperable, and so forth. So let's just think about it today. Our data should be portable, just like our phone number became portable. The apps of the future should be interoperable, just like carriers are interoperable. We shouldn't be clicking on the terms of use of 5 big platforms. We should be, the new app should be built and clicking on our terms of use for our data. It's very simple. It's very basic, and it's all quite doable. And we actually have a use case now that's migrating to DSMP, and you're actually building one, or Deb Roy is building one here at MIT. Another one that, and this one being built at Harvard, and they'll be interoperable, and we'll demonstrate all this. I would add one more point. There's value. Your social graph, this aggregated data, is worth far more than a telephone number. There's a whole new economy that's going to evolve here, a data sharing economy, which will be a great equalizer. This is a huge impact project as well. If we can return to people what is rightfully theirs and restore faith and trust and in the system, because right now it's gone, we have the best of both worlds. We save democracy, we share value, and I would say we do the most important thing. We start protecting children, because we're not protecting children right now, which is our most important responsibility as adults and as officials in government or university presidents or whatever. What are we doing? This is just not right, and we can fix it, and we must before the explosion of AI. Because AI can do so many wonderful things to solve problems. And we can get to a point where our kids will live till 150 years old, healthy lives, but not the direction we're going right now, because we're just not going to get there. And this is back to a choice. Are we subjects or citizens?
Ron.
Thank you very much. Wonderful panel. The theme that many people touched upon, and Brian argued in a somewhat understated way, I want to sort of amplify that and ask the question that it implies. So something that traditional economics and I think a lot of computer scientists and others sort of agree is you don't mess with the innovation process. The invention goes wherever it goes, and if there's policy, regulation, that should come downstream. And I think what you pointed out, Brian, is that for many of the problems that we're facing, such as cybersecurity, climate change, that doesn't make sense, that we have to change innovation. Okay, you don't need to preach to me. I'm the converted here. I've been arguing this for a very long time, but it's still a minority view. And I think part of the reason why it's the minority view is because we don't have the infrastructure for having reasonable policy on the direction of innovation. We don't have the norms, we don't have agencies, we don't have expertise, and we don't have, what is democratic control or what is government control of innovation that doesn't become stifling. So how do we build that? How do we make sure that, when you discuss redirecting innovation, and I think that's what Frank is about, and I think Dan has thought a lot about this as well, that doesn't become like hijacking of innovation.
Yeah, I think I have sort of an incremental and an existential view on that question, right? I think existentially, what it actually requires is a sort of a shifting of the viewpoint of fundamentally what's the right governmental role and governmental function in innovation policy. And you do have to go back to this view that if the government is, government plays an important role in fostering innovation, government plays an important role in regulating innovation, but only to the degree that you start with the question of innovation to what public end, right? To what public good? I think that you've got to shift that, and that is a generational shift. It's a shift in people and institutions and processes. The incremental piece is we are running a lot of actual experiments in the U.S. government right now in moving us closer to this direction, in pulling us closer to that, and creating a system of being able to assess them and amplify them and then expand them radically when we see that they are succeeding, I think is the most fruitful way of doing that in the short term. And also with a practical recognition that in almost all cases, they are controversial because they are upending an existing embedded structure where there's a lot of economic rent on the other side of the table. So there also has to be a certain willingness to be disruptive when the disruption is actually at the expense of somebody who is currently holding a significant economic rent, but being able to identify and defend that actually a lot of that is actually a public good that needs to be approached differently. But I don't want to leave this group with a pessimism. The number of experiments that we're running today that I'm quite optimistic are going to prove out and that we could scale quite significantly is high, which means it's an important moment for us to be spending more time on how we can effectively and quickly analyze and scale.
And on that optimistic note, we are out of time. So I want to thank all our panelists for this very interesting discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Sally.